From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello, and welcome to the Free Expression podcast from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already a subscriber, please do sign up to Free Expression wherever you do your podcast listening. This week, Donald Trump's legal problems may be deep, but his political prospects seem to be improving all the time. Current polling shows him ahead of President Joe Biden in the national race, and with a small but consistent lead in polls of the key swing states in November. So just 5 months away from the election, a second Trump term looks increasingly probable. So this week, and from time to time over the next few months, we're going to take a look at what a second Trump administration might look like. What would he try to do in key policy areas? Who might staff his administration? What challenges is he likely to have to confront? We're starting this week with what may be both a key reason for his current polling success and the biggest immediate policy challenge he'll face if he is elected. That's immigration. In 3.5 years of the Biden administration, America's southern border has been more porous than at any time in modern history. Estimates vary, but certainly people agree that many millions of migrants have entered the U.S. illegally to live and work here in the last 3 years. So what will Donald Trump do to fix this continuing border crisis? Well, to answer that question, I hope, I'm joined this week by Chad Wolf. Chad served as acting Secretary of Homeland Security in the first Trump administration, and he's currently the executive director of the America First Policy Institute, a Trump-supporting think tank, which is coming up with all kinds of policies for a second Trump term. Chad Wolf is also founder and president of his own consulting firm, and he's spent time in his long career working as a staffer on Capitol Hill. And Chad Wolf joins me now. Chad, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you're very much involved in thinking about and planning for what a second Trump administration will look like. And particularly, a lot of people are very focused on the area of immigration, obviously, which has been an incredible mess for the last few years. And we want to hear what you're thinking about that and what a second Trump term might mean for that. But can I just start with a more general question, which is you served in that first Trump term. How would a second Trump term differ? I mean, obviously, it's 8 years on. The challenges will be different. There are all kinds of things. But in terms of the planning and preparation that's going into this, how do you think a second Trump term, should he be elected in November, what would be the key differences from the first term?
Well, let me just say from the outset, I don't speak for President Trump. I don't speak for the campaign. They're very clear on what they're kind of running on. It's Agenda 47, which has its own website. So I just want to be abundantly clear on that front. Now, from the America First perspective and the America First Policy Institute, and obviously my background, we advocate for certain things to occur that should be occurring along that border. And we take a different approach than what you see over the last 3.5 years. So I think there's a number of things to talk about. The first place I always start when people ask me, well, what could it possibly look like in a second term? I go back to the first term, right? It's not as though the former president is running without a record. He has a record of accomplishments, particularly in this area. And so I would point you back to things that were successful during the first 4 years of the Trump administration. And then how do you build on that? But you said it correctly. It'll be 4 years later, possibly, if he does win. And so it's a new environment with a different set of challenges. You just simply can't revert back to 2020 or 2021 and say, okay, we're going to pick up where we left off. The world has moved on. The border challenges, crisis has moved on. It's a new environment you got to address. And so you got to look at all of that and come up with different solutions. But what I will say is that you are likely to see President Trump obviously governing on an America First approach, which he did so for 4 years. My assumption is it will be the same. You'll see just a different approach to what you see over the last 3.5 years, where it is clearly not holding people accountable, clearly not wanting to deter any behavior. A number of things, I think, will be night and day difference between the current administration's policies and those America First policies.
I do want to get onto that, and I will in detail. But and again, I completely understand you don't speak for the former president, you don't speak for the campaign. But again, you've been working at AFPI on key policy areas. And again, as I say, you did serve, of course, in the first administration. I suppose one way that a lot of people think about the first Trump term is that given that Trump was very much at that point an outsider and very new to politics, I mean, he'd obviously had a successful campaign, but he was new and certainly new to government. There was a kind of a sense that, again, from an outsider's perspective, it seemed to be a sort of a mix, especially in terms of the staffing and the policies to some extent, sort of traditional Republicans A lot of people who've been around the Republican Party for a long time who might have served in any Republican president's administration. Policies like on taxes and on foreign policy, in certain areas of foreign policy, similar to kind of areas of typical Republican foreign policy. It does seem as though, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that this would be a more distinctively Trumpian, if I can call it that term, that he served one term as president. He served a term, he served 3.5 years out of office. He's had a lot more time to think and prepare. Do you think that's right? It would have less of the elements of traditional Republican administrations and more a distinctively and identifiably Trump set of policies.
Well, again, I'm going to let the former president speak for himself on how he would govern. What I can tell you is based on my experience in the Trump administration, and now for the 3 or so years I've been at the America First Policy Institute, I would say, look, the former president's a Republican, conservative values. Now, it's a different flavor, right? Certainly an America First flavor, America First movement to that. But it's not an abandonment of those principles. But I do agree with you. I'm not sure he was well served, at least in the early stages in 17 and 18, of having the right team on the field, right? It's not enough just to have Republicans or conservatives or whoever it is working. You've got to believe in the president's agenda. And I think we really didn't have the full team on until the last couple of years of that administration. So I'm hopeful that if he does win, that it picks up from there. And obviously you add new team members. But to your point, I think a lot of people didn't know what to expect. And so people that would have worked, for instance, a President Romney or a President McCain, were eager to serve under President Trump, but soon found out that President Trump not only governs, but operates in a different manner. And some of them simply just didn't like it.
Yeah.
Some of them thought it wasn't refined enough for their measure. And a lot of them left and a lot of them got fired. And so I am hopeful that you avoid all of that because there's that record to run on and that experience that you learn from, that you get the right people on the field really from day one.
All right, so let's turn particularly to immigration, which you've spent a lot of time, as they talking and writing about and saying, serving in the previous administration, dealing with it. As I said at the beginning, we've got an enormous immigration crisis in this country. Millions and millions of people have entered illegally. The Biden administration's policies seem to be responsible for a very, very large part of that, particularly reversing many of President Trump's measures. So what do you think, if you were advising the president right now, and say he's just been elected, you're in the transition team, you're advising him, what would be the immediate measures that a re-elected President Trump should take?
Yeah, and we write a lot about this at America First Policy Institute, so you can obviously find a lot of this on our website as well. I think you got to look at a variety of different things. You've got to look at both from a border security standpoint, and a lot of people confuse border security with immigration. These are two separate concepts. What occurs is, from a border security standpoint is how are you imposing law and making sure people aren't illegally crossing, and if they do, that you hold them accountable versus the legal immigration side of the house. So you've got border security, you've got interior enforcement, and then you've got some immigration components such as asylum and some other aspects. All of it needs to be looked at. I think most of all, you've got to change the dynamic that's on that border now. Border Patrol law enforcement officers are frustrated. The morale is down. You've got to fix that right away. And that in large part is to being in the middle of a crisis for 3.5 years. It really hasn't subsided much. And so I think they've lost confidence in their political leadership. So if you are the president or you're the secretary of the department, you've got to go in there and say, I've got a game plan and we're going to start executing on this game plan to get us out of this crisis. And so that you, being a law enforcement officer, see some light at the end of the tunnel. And so that means deterrence. That means consequences to illegal behavior. That means ending catch and release. It means a variety of different things. It allows ICE to remove individuals from the country. All these things that have been staples, I would say, are immigration policies over multiple administrations. It was only until the Biden administration where we stopped doing most of this, which is why we're in the situation that we're in today. So I think obviously you look back at what worked during the Trump administration and then you build on it from there.
All right, so there's a lot there, and I totally take the point about border security and migration. Let's start with the asylum process, which again is clearly, I think, again, even its strongest defenders would acknowledge it has been distorted and abused right now. And again, I'm sure there are many of the policies that Trump had in place that Biden immediately reversed when he took office, and I assume President Trump would replace those. But on asylum in particular, what's the way to deal with, again, you mentioned deterrence. A lot of this would involve presumably discussions with other countries. What's the best way to deal with that enormous problem that we seem to have right now?
There's a number of things I think you have to do. If Congress isn't going to take action and actually reform the asylum process, which they should do, right? Because it's badly broken. But there's a lot of differing views, and I haven't really seen a lot of coalescence around one view on how to reform that. So set that aside. There are executive actions using executive authority that can be done from the executive. And so whether that is reinstituting a Remain in Mexico type of program, that was the migrant protection protocols, which got to the issue of asylum very, very specifically. It's what it was designed to address. You do that in conjunction. You could do some asylum bars, this idea that individuals are asylum shopping, which is to say, they travel through 4, 5, 6 different countries only to seek asylum in the United States, right? Where if they were truly seeking asylum, they could gain asylum protections in other safe third countries. So you cut out the idea of this asylum shopping, asylum cooperative agreements, which we had in place during the Trump administration with countries. I think you can do all of these, and you can do all of these on a grander scale if you really want to change the dynamic and make sure that our asylum process is not being overly abused, which I think any objective observer would say that it is. And the whole idea of doing all of this is to, one, root out the fraud. I don't think any American wants to see our immigration processes abused. And two, it's getting those that need asylum protections under U.S. law, those protections as soon as possible, and not having them wait 5 to 7 years, which they currently have to do to see an immigration judge in order to go through the process to get those asylum protections. And then, of course, to do that, you've got to draw down the flood of folks that are coming in and that are approaching that border. So it would have the secondary effect of actually easing the humanitarian crisis that we see along that border as well.
Again, what we're talking obviously mostly about executive actions. And again, let's make 2 bold assumptions here. Let's assume Donald Trump has been elected president, and let's assume there's a Republican majority in say, both houses of Congress. You presumably would want to see, and obviously many members of Congress want to see, pretty fundamental legislative change to the asylum laws as they stand, right?
Yeah, I think they definitely need to be reformed. I think you got to look at the credible fear standard. You've got to look at a variety of things when it comes to asylum. And it doesn't all involve DHS, although a large amount does. It also involves DOJ and making sure that you can get those immigration judges at least hearing border cases quickly. There's a variety of things that need to occur. You're not going to change it overnight, right? The asylum system is badly, badly broken, being abused. And so I think there's both legislative and executive actions that you can take to address this. And you probably need both, because the odds of getting a legislation on immigration, really early on in any administration is probably, I don't know that that's going to happen.
What about a border security and enforcement? And again, this will be a mix, presumably, of legislation and executive action. And we saw, obviously, that measure that did come before Congress a few months ago and which eventually failed. I mean, we are talking here, presumably, about significantly beefed up border enforcement, greater number of law enforcement officers there. One criticism of the first Donald Trump administration was that famous wall didn't really ever get completed, didn't get built. What could we expect in terms of border security, border enforcement from a second Trump term?
Yeah. So, during the Trump administration, we built over 450 miles of that border wall system. So the physical infrastructure, the roads, the lights, the cameras, the fiber optic cables, all of that, we had plans to continue to build. Obviously, that stopped with the Biden administration. A lot of that prefab steel bollards are still on the desert ground. I was just in Yuma, Arizona along the border, and that equipment is just laying on the ground right now while there are gaps in that wall as the contractors were building it. So I do think that you need to finish some of that border wall in priority locations, and that really comes from the advice of Border Patrol agents. They know where they need that physical infrastructure because of vanishing times, because of a variety of different reasons. They know where they need it. So I think we should listen to them and give them those resources. I think it's a variety of things. I think you can use whether the incoming president wants to declare emergency along the border that frees up a number of authorities and activities on how to turn back migrants who aren't showing up at a port of entry. I think there's a variety of things that you can do. Some of that we did during Title 42, some of it, obviously during COVID. But there are some unique authorities that can be done. I think in large part, it depends on what does the environment and the situation look like if he is reelected in January of 2025. Are we still seeing 4,000 to 6,000 illegal crossings a day, which is just astronomically high? I think people have been immune to that, and the Biden administration has basically established that as the new status quo. That should never be the status quo. And so there's got to be an enforcement kind of posture along that border, interdicting individuals and things coming across that border. And then you've got to look at the population flows. Is it single adults? Is it children? Is it families that are coming across? Are they seeking asylum? Not everyone does. Some people will tell you they're here to get a better job. How do you remove them? So overall, there just needs to be a different approach and a different look on how to manage the border and make sure that you're sending the signal to everyone else around the world who wants to come here that now is not the time to come here illegally. And if you do, there's going to be consequences. You're going to either be turned away or you're going to remove back home. But what you won't be is simply released into American communities.
That's a key question. Obviously, catch and release, as it's called, has been a kind of hallmark of the immigration system in the last few years, the asylum system in particular. What's the right way to tackle that? Because that happens obviously because very large numbers coming across. Courts can't process them immediately. Law enforcement can't process them. So people are, as we know, released into the country and given a kind of an abstract future date, and they never show up. How do you end that?
Well, sure. And again, it's not just one thing. You've got to stem the flow of individuals coming across. So you've got to reduce the incentive factors, right? The pull factors that we talk about. They've got to know that they don't have a 70% chance of being released into American communities. Once people start to understand that they make this dangerous journey and they perhaps sell everything that they own to do it only to get turned around and to remove back to their home country, well, what we saw is people stop taking that dangerous journey, right? They start to understand that it's not worth doing that only to come across here illegally and knowing that you'll never qualify for asylum. 87% of people never qualify for asylum, but yet they use the asylum process to get into the country and then to remain here. So you've got to reduce the overall flow. Again, Remain in Mexico was designed to help the asylum system. You could go back to a version thereof, and whether you can go back to how it existed in 2020 and 2021, I don't know. It'll be 4 years later. And whether you do that just with Mexico or you do it with other countries as well. This idea that the United States is the only country in the world that you can seek asylum in, it's not how the whole system is supposed to work. If you're seeking asylum, you seek refuge in the safest third country closest to your home country, with the idea is that once conditions approve, you go back to your home country. It doesn't happen in every circumstance, but that is sort of the international norm. And yet we don't really adhere to it here in the Western Hemisphere. So I think you got to take a holistic look at how you're running your immigration system and saying just because it's operated this way, just because we've done catch and release for the last 20 years, that's not to say that that's the right way to do this. I think the American people, by every standard, want a different approach along that border. So I think it's a mix of things that worked in the past and new ideas and new initiatives.
What role could technology play? You've written a lot about this. I've read this on your website. Obviously, technology is advancing. Everybody's very focused on AI and the way that is transforming pretty well every aspect of our lives. What opportunities are there for implementing the most up-to-date technology, and how could it be used in any of these ways to get control of migration?
Yeah, I think technology is key. I think there's always going to be that right mix between people, technology, and policies, right? And you're always looking for that. So from a technology perspective of what Border Patrol, law enforcement needs along that border to help them secure that border, to the technology that you have to, as you process individuals, making sure that they are, if someone comes across and they say they're a family, that you need to make sure that that child isn't being trafficked. And technology, rapid DNA, and others can play a role there. So I think there is definitely a role for technology. You're not going to, this may be a bad phrase, you're not going to technology your way out of the crisis that we see here today. The crisis is not a resource issue. It's not, let's throw a bunch of money and tech at it and we'll solve it. This is mainly a policy issue. You've got to first get the policy right. You got to understand what your goal is here. And then is your goal to let everyone in and then sort it out later, which is kind of the current approach? Or is it we want to understand who's coming in, why they're coming in, and making sure they're fully vetted and making sure they're not fraudulently using our asylum and other systems to come into the country? And I think there's fundamentally a different approach on how you do that. And by turning people away and saying you won't get in, you're actually stopping a humanitarian crisis from occurring in the first place versus continuing to incentivize it. And so all that is to say is that technology will play a critical role in investigations in the law enforcement side. So yeah, definitely a technology component.
There's been some discussion of this, I know, and again, I've read various ideas on this, but the possibility of doing deals with third-party countries who might be encouraged, might be persuaded to take some asylum seekers. This is very much a topic in the UK, as you know, right now. The Conservative government has signed a deal with Rwanda. Nobody's actually gone yet, but the idea is that asylum seekers, especially those who don't meet the various standards for asylum, would actually be sent to Rwanda, a country obviously in the middle of Africa. I know this, but that's been looked at. Is that something that you'd like to see the US attempt to do, maybe with some people applying for asylum like that?
Well, certainly this idea of safe third countries around the world that individuals can seek asylum and gain those protections until, again, conditions in their home country improve. It's an international standard. It's what should be done around the world. Again, in part, it's designed to get away from folks saying, okay, I need asylum status. Now I'm in wherever, North Africa, I'm wherever, and I need to go to the UK. Well, guess what? You go through Italy, you go through all these other EU countries that you could seek, refuge and asylum status and protections from. And the same applies here in the Western Hemisphere. When we see special interest aliens that fly into Brazil, make their way through Ecuador, make their way through the Darien Gaps, through Central America, through Mexico, only to arrive at our southern border and claim asylum, something's wrong with that process. There are many other countries they can seek asylum and gain those protections. And so whether you need to work with those third countries, you need to improve their asylum processes. I think there's a lot of outreach that you need to do, and there's a lot of progress and I would say success that you could build on from the first Trump administration where we had some of those agreements in place. I think you could certainly do more there because it shouldn't be that only one or two countries in the world needs to accept the vast majority of folks seeking asylum or refugee status.
We're going to take a short break there, but when we come back, I'll have more with Chad Wolf, who served as acting Secretary of Homeland Security in Donald Trump's administration. And we're talking about what Donald Trump may do, particularly on immigration, in a second Trump term. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with Chad Wolf, who served in the first Trump administration. We're talking about the policies that Donald Trump may pursue in a second term, especially in the area of immigration, if he is elected in November. Let's talk about something you raised right at the start, which is the question of people who are already here illegally. Many of them maybe have been here for many, many years. We don't know the exact number, but we do know they're in the many millions, and they've created families here and have jobs here and all of that. And the former president has talked about dealing with that. There have been, again, various ideas about this, but a very aggressive enforcement campaign, essentially to find these people, to locate them, to repatriate them to wherever they came from, or even there's even been talks about creating camps where they would be maybe kept until they could be returned. What's the thinking on all of this, and how would we go about finding these people, and what should be done with them when they are found?
Yeah, I think the thinking here is let's let ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, an element of the department, actually do their job that they're constitutionally mandated to do by Congress. What we've seen from this administration, and it started really on day one, where President Biden said for the first 100 days, we're not deporting anyone, even serious criminals. We're not deporting them. They fundamentally don't like removing individuals from the country, and that sent a very dangerous message. And at the same time, over the last 3 years, where you have astronomically high apprehension numbers, you have enormously low removal numbers from ICE law enforcement officers. And so first and foremost, I would say, let's let them do their job. It's a job Congress told them to do. It's what they've been hired to do. So let's let them do their job. And I think what we saw during the Trump administration is they know how to do it. You got to give them some direction, but they will do it. Now, the idea here is there's a variety of different segments, and there's a variety of different folks that obviously come across that border, and they go into different status, right? They go depending on what they're claiming, where they are in their court system, their due process system, on and on and on, right? And so I don't think that there's probably any debate on should we remove hardened criminals from the country who come across the border. I think most everyone says yes. National security threats, most everyone says yes. Well, what about the 1.5 million final orders of removal of individuals who've probably come across the border in, last 10 years or more, who've gone through the court system and in some cases have seen 3 different immigration judges, depending on all their appeals. And in every case, they say you don't have a right to be here. You need to leave the country. You need to voluntarily deport yourself. And we have 1.5 million of those individuals who have said, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay here in the United States, right? And so either we're a country of rule of law or we're not. And so I would say that those individuals should be repatriated or removed. Now, I think the premise of your question goes to the heart of the debate, right? Which is, yes, some of them could be here for years. They could have families, absolutely. But does that make their status here any different, or the reasons on why they chose to ignore 3 immigration judges in U.S. law, does it make it any better from someone who's only been here 6 months? And so I think there are some different segments of that illegal population that you've got to look at and make some hard choices. But just because it's hard, or just because it's going to be unpopular, or it's going to take a time to do it, doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. You got to follow the law. You've got to implement the law, and you've got to do it, really from day one to bring some of that deterrence back in. If people know that they can cross the border, get released within 48 to 72 hours, and know that wherever community that they're probably not going to be encountered by ICE law enforcement officials and removal officials, well, guess what? That's why you continue to see millions and millions and millions of more continue to come.
One way you could, presumably that is a potentially fruitful avenue for finding these people and enforcing, as you say, immigration law would be through employers. Of course, employers are required to make sure that people are here legally, but as we know, significant numbers probably don't. Would that be something that could be toughened up, that employers could be held much more legally liable to ensure that they are employing people who are here legally?
Yeah, I think it all should, as I normally say, everything should be on the table when we look at trying to solve this crisis and making sure that employers are obviously following the law, that they're hiring folks that have work permits, the U.S. citizens with the right visas. Obviously, we hand out visas for different types of work, whether it's H-1B, H-2A, H-2B, a variety of different legal ways in which individuals can come and work and then leave the country. Making sure employers follow that, I think, is critically important as well. So I think everything needs to be looked at. It's not just one, right? It's not just the employer's fault or the other side. I think it's a combination. So everything needs to be on the table and looked at.
What do you think would be a reasonable target? No one knows, as we've said, how many exactly of these people there are. You've talked about the 1.5 million who've already faced court orders to remove themselves. What would be a reasonable target for a second Trump term? Would it be getting most of those, at least, who have faced those orders? And the other categories you mentioned, obviously, violent criminals, threats to national security. Would you think that if you've managed to get a significant number of those, if you've managed to get a significant number of those who do face these orders, if you've managed to get them removed, would that be a worthwhile aim for an administration?
I think it's a good start. I've been out of service now for 3.5 years, so I'm not going to pretend to understand what ICE is facing and kind of the map of the people that have gone through the process over the last 3.5 years, new people that have gotten new final orders of removal in other categories. I think you also got to look at the hundreds of thousands of folks that have been paroled here in the United States under the Biden administration. The numbers that we have seen have never happened before. Hundreds of thousands of folks. Now, parole is only a 2-year status. And so what happens when they fall out of status as well? And how do you proactively do that? You got to look at voluntary departure. Individuals that have been here illegally but voluntarily leave perhaps can come back legally a lot sooner, because if you're removed and you're here illegally, there are bars on you returning back to the United States even legally. So there's probably things that you can do to incentivize a voluntary departure as well. So none of it's easy. If it's easy, it would already been done. But I think you've got to get at it, and you've got to get local law enforcement. There's law enforcement across this country that knows their communities best. They know who's in their communities. They know who they're picking up, right? This goes to the issue of sanctuary cities and others. And so we've got to incentivize local law enforcement to cooperate with federal law enforcement. If they pick up individuals that don't have a legal right to be in the country that are committing crimes, we'll turn them over to law enforcement, federal, ICE, and they can remove them. We don't see that happening in large numbers today.
What about legal immigration? That's obviously been a very important source of talent, of economic success here for the United States. There's always a large discussion going on about the number of H-1B visas. We always know that employers are pushing for more. There are other routes in, chain migration, as it's called, for legal migrants. All of it rather piecemeal and much of it also rather controversial, I think it's fair to say. What do you think a second Trump administration, what approach would it take to legal immigration?
Yeah, it's a great issue, and it's an issue that Congress really needs to sink their teeth into and debate and come up with some solutions. I think during the first Trump administration, we certainly talked about merit-based, and whether you use that terminology or different terminology, the idea that you're going to bring individuals into the country illegally that A, can support themselves, and that B, have something to add to the country, to the economy, seems to be a foreign idea and a concept of it. It really shouldn't be, right? Our immigration system should first serve the American people and the American interest first. And so we need to build around that when we start taking a look at what are those legal immigration policies that we need to look at that probably need to be reformed. A few of them that you mentioned are badly abused. You know, there's a lottery system for, I think it's H-1B, that's badly abused. And so all of this needs to be looked at. I think first you've got to secure the border. I think if you look historically, you know, the Congress and previous administrations have said, hey, let's give this certain segment amnesty and then we'll secure the border. And then it's just never happened. And then we continue to get these populations in here of what do we have to do with DACA, right? I can guarantee you in a couple of years, we're going to be saying, well, what do we need to do with the 9 million people that came into the country during the Biden administration, right? And so I think there are some things that you've got to deal with, but you got to secure the border first, because why would anyone subject themselves to vetting of a visa program if they can simply walk across the border and get work authorization shortly thereafter? So secure the border, have a real debate about immigration reform. What are the right levels? What are the right programs? And really have that, but make sure that it's based off of something that the country and the American people need, I think is the kind of the way to go about it.
Final question, and it's about you. I'm sure you probably won't give me a direct answer, but again, you did serve, your term was obviously truncated as acting Homeland Security Secretary in the first Trump administration for legal reasons, which were controversial in themselves. But you've been thinking very much about this. You've been developing policies on this. Do you see yourself serving in another Trump term? Should he ask you?
Well, yeah, sure. What I'm focused on is making sure that we return to some normalcy and some rational thought as it relates to both border security, immigration enforcement, and then the larger immigration context. To answer your specific question, I think it's always a privilege to be asked to serve by any president. And so I would certainly consider that. I'm not advocating for any position. And I think the president, the campaign, and others will certainly have their specific thoughts and views on that.
Chad Wolf of the America First Policy Institute, former acting Secretary of Homeland Security. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Thanks.
Well, that's it for this week. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression. I'll be back next week with another conversation. Hope you'll join us then. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.